Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her hands, trained to save lives, would one day control one of the most lethal weapons systems ever created. Growing up in a small town in Oklahoma, she watched the sky with wonder, but flying seemed like a distant dream reserved for people from different worlds. Her father worked at the local hardware store, and her mother taught elementary school. They were good, honest people who believed in hard work and service to others. That belief shaped everything Sarah would become. The summer heat hung heavy over the high school football field as Sarah walked across the stage to receive her diploma. She was 18, with her whole life stretching ahead of her like an unmarked road. Most of her classmates had plans for college or jobs at the factories nearby. Sarah wanted something different, something that would challenge her and give her purpose. The military had always intrigued her, not for the glory or the uniforms, but for the chance to serve something greater than herself. 3 months later, Sarah found herself at a recruitment office in Oklahoma City. The building was plain, with posters showing soldiers in various roles plastered across the walls. A sergeant with kind eyes and a firm handshake listened to her story. She told him about her desire to help people, to make a real difference. He nodded thoughtfully and suggested she consider becoming a combat medic. The idea resonated with Sarah immediately. She could serve her country while doing what felt most natural to her, caring for others in their moments of greatest need. Basic training stripped away the comfortable layers of civilian life. Fort Jackson, South Carolina, became her entire world for 10 weeks. The drill sergeants shouted, the runs were endless, and the obstacle courses seemed designed by someone who hated sleep. Sarah discovered reserves of strength she never knew existed. She learned to push through exhaustion, to focus when her body screamed for rest, and to work as part of a team where everyone's survival depended on everyone else. After basic training came advanced individual training for combat medics at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. Here, Sarah's real education began. She learned anatomy and physiology, how to start IVs under pressure, how to treat gunshot wounds, and traumatic injuries. The instructors were veterans who had seen real combat, and they shared stories that made the training feel urgent and vital. Sarah absorbed everything like a sponge. She practiced bandaging techniques until her fingers moved automatically. She studied pharmacology late into the night, memorizing drug interactions and dosages that could mean the difference between life and death. The other students in her class came from all walks of life. There was Marcus from Detroit, who joined to escape gang violence in his neighborhood. Jennifer from rural Montana, who grew up on a ranch and was tougher than anyone Sarah had ever met. And David from New York City, whose brother had been killed in Afghanistan and who carried that loss like a weight on his shoulders. They became Sarah's family, bound together by shared hardship and a common purpose. One particular training exercise stood out in Sarah's memory. The instructors set up a mock battlefield with smoke, simulated gunfire, and actors playing wounded soldiers. The chaos was overwhelming. Screams filled the air, and the smoke made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah's heart pounded as she ran from casualty to casualty, assessing injuries and prioritizing treatment. One actor had a fake compound fracture with bone protruding through the skin. Another had simulated shrapnel wounds across his chest. A third was unconscious, supposedly from a blast injury. Sarah's training kicked in. She moved methodically, checking airways, controlling bleeding, and calling for evacuation. Her hands shook slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm. The instructors watched everything, noting every decision and every hesitation. When the exercise ended, Sarah was drenched in sweat and emotionally drained. The head instructor, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, pulled her aside. He told her she had done well, but needed to work on her speed. In real combat, he said, every second mattered. Sarah took the criticism to heart and doubled down on her training. Graduation from medic school filled Sarah with pride and purpose. She received her assignment to the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The Screaming Eagles, as they were known, had a storied history dating back to World War II. Sarah felt honored to join their ranks. She arrived at Fort Campbell on a crisp autumn day, the leaves just beginning to turn gold and red. The base was massive, a small city dedicated to the profession of arms. Her unit, Bravo Company of the 1st Battalion, welcomed her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Sarah was young, barely 20 years old, and some of the soldiers wondered if she had what it took when things got real. She understood their doubts. Trust had to be earned, especially in a profession where lives hung in the balance. Sarah set out to prove herself through competence and dedication. The daily routine at Fort Campbell was demanding. Physical training started before dawn, with runs that seemed to stretch forever through the Kentucky hills. After PT came breakfast, followed by training that ranged from medical drills to tactical exercises. Sarah carried her aid bag everywhere, the weight of its contents a constant reminder of her responsibility. Inside were bandages, tourniquets, needles, medications, and all the tools she might need to save a life in the field. Sarah's first real test came during a training rotation at the Joint Readiness Training Center in Fort Polk, Louisiana. The JRTC was designed to simulate real combat conditions as closely as possible. Opposing forces, played by specially trained soldiers, attacked her unit using realistic tactics. The environment was unforgiving, hot, and humid with thick vegetation that made movement difficult. Sarah's platoon found itself in a complex ambush scenario during the 3rd day of the exercise. The attack came without warning. Simulated gunfire erupted from multiple directions, and several soldiers went down with mock injuries. Sarah sprinted toward the nearest casualty, her aid bag bouncing against her back. The soldier, a private named Collins, was role-playing a sucking chest wound. Sarah assessed the injury quickly, sealed the wound with a special dressing, and ensured his airway was clear. While she worked, bullets cracked overhead, and the chaos of battle swirled around her. She moved to the next casualty, then the next, working with focused intensity. The platoon sergeant watched her performance carefully. When the exercise ended and the after-action review began, he praised Sarah's calm demeanor and effective treatment. The respect in his eyes meant more to Sarah than any medal. She was becoming part of the team, not just the medic but a trusted member of the unit. Months passed in a blur of training and preparation. Sarah grew stronger, more confident in her skills and her place in the unit. She formed deep friendships with her fellow soldiers. They shared meals, complained about the same things, and looked out for each other. Sarah became known for her quick laugh and her willingness to help anyone who needed it. She also gained a reputation for being tough during medical training, refusing to cut corners or accept anything less than excellence from herself. One evening, as Sarah sat in the barracks writing a letter home to her parents, her squad leader knocked on the door. He told her the unit had received deployment orders. They were going to Afghanistan in 3 months. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had trained for this moment, but the reality of it felt different from the abstract idea. Afghanistan meant real combat, real wounds, and real consequences. Sarah finished her letter but found herself unable to sleep that night, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The preparation for deployment intensified. The unit conducted more F. The plane touched down at Bagram Airfield in the early hours of the morning. Sarah peered through the small window as Afghanistan revealed itself in shades of brown and gray, mountains rising in the distance like ancient sentinels. The air outside was thin and cold, a stark contrast to the recycled atmosphere of the aircraft. As she descended the steps onto the tarmac, the reality of her situation crystallized. This was a war zone, and she was now part of it. Bagram was a sprawling military base, a small American city transplanted into the Afghan landscape. Concrete barriers lined the roads, sandbags surrounded every building, and the constant sound of helicopters filled the air. Sarah and her unit were processed through reception, issued additional gear, and briefed on the specific threats they would face. Improvised explosive devices were the primary danger, along with small arms fire and rocket attacks on the base itself. The briefing officer spoke in matter-of-fact tones about casualties and evacuation procedures, making the abstract training suddenly concrete and urgent. Sarah's company was assigned to Forward Operating Base Ghazni, a smaller outpost several hours south of Bagram. The convoy to Ghazni was Sarah's first real exposure to the country beyond the wire. The vehicles rolled through valleys and over rough roads, past villages where children waved and adults watched with unreadable expressions. The beauty of the landscape was undeniable, but so was the tension. Every pile of trash could hide an IED. Every overpass was a potential ambush site. Sarah kept her medical bag close and her senses alert. Forward Operating Base Ghazni was austere compared to Bagram. The base was built around an old Afghan fort, with American modifications adding guard towers, living quarters, and operational facilities. Sarah's living space was a plywood hut she shared with 3 other female soldiers. The accommodations were basic, but they were safe, and that was what mattered. The base had a small aid station where Sarah would work alongside the physician assistant and another medic. The PA, a captain named Williams, greeted Sarah warmly and showed her around the facility. It was well-stocked but cramped, designed to handle trauma stabilization before evacuating serious cases to larger hospitals. The rhythm of life at the FOB took some getting used to. The days were long and often monotonous, punctuated by moments of intense activity. Sarah accompanied patrols into the surrounding area, her aid bag always within reach. The Afghan landscape was harsh but beautiful, with terraced fields carved into hillsides and mud brick villages that had stood for centuries. The local people were wary of the American soldiers, their experiences with foreign forces colored by decades of conflict. Sarah's first Real casualty came 3 weeks into the deployment. A patrol had hit an IED on a road north of the FOB. The radio crackled with urgent calls for medical support. Sarah's heart raced as she grabbed her bag and ran to the vehicle that would take her to the site. The drive seemed to take forever, every second stretching as she mentally reviewed her training. When they arrived, the scene was chaos. One vehicle was badly damaged, smoke rising from the wreckage. Soldiers were scattered around, some providing security while others worked to extract the wounded. Sarah jumped from the vehicle and ran to the first casualty. It was Specialist Henderson, a quiet kid from Iowa who loved to talk about his family's farm. He had severe injuries to both legs from the blast. Sarah's training took over, pushing aside the shock and the horror. She applied tourniquets to stop the massive bleeding, started in 4 to replace lost fluids, and administered pain medication. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Around her, the other medics worked on 2 more casualties while the rest of the patrol maintained security. The medical evacuation helicopter arrived within 20 minutes, the fastest 20 minutes of Sarah's life. She helped load Henderson onto the aircraft, shouting vital information to the flight medic over the roar of the rotors. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Henderson toward the hospital at Bagram, Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion mixed with relief. She had done her job. Whether it would be enough, only time would tell. Back at the FOB, Sarah couldn't shake the images from her mind. Henderson's pale face, the blood soaking into the Afghan dirt, the desperate urgency of trying to save his life. Captain Williams found her sitting alone outside the aid station as the sun set. He sat down next to her without saying anything for a long moment. Then, he told her she had done well, that her quick action had probably saved Henderson's life. Sarah nodded, grateful for the words, but still processing the trauma of the experience. This was different from training, different from anything she had imagined. This was real, and the weight of that reality was heavier than she had expected. The weeks that followed brought more casualties. Some were from IEDs, others from firefights with insurgent forces. Sarah treated gunshot wounds, blast injuries, heat stroke, and a dozen other medical emergencies. She became more efficient, her movements more practiced, but the emotional toll never got easier. Each wounded soldier was someone's son or daughter, someone's friend or partner. Sarah carried that weight with her, adding each name to the mental list of people she had tried to help. Between the emergencies, life at the FOB continued with its own strange normalcy. Sarah worked out in the makeshift gym, read books sent from home, and wrote long emails to her family and to friends. She grew close to the other soldiers in her unit, the shared experience of deployment creating bonds that felt deeper than ordinary friendships. They watched movies on laptops, played cards, and told stories about their lives before the army. These moments of peace were precious, brief respites from the constant awareness of danger. One afternoon, Sarah was inventorying medical supplies in the aid station when she heard a sound that would change everything. Apache attack helicopters flew over the base, their distinctive profile unmistakable against the bright sky. Sarah stepped outside to watch them, mesmerized by their power and grace. The Apaches were legends in the military, sophisticated weapons platforms flown by some of the most highly trained pilots in the world. As she watched them disappear over the mountains, Sarah felt something stir inside her, a spark of possibility she had never considered before. That evening, Sarah found herself in the base's recreation tent where soldiers gathered to use the computers and Wi-Fi. She started researching what it took to become an Army helicopter pilot. The requirements were daunting. Candidates needed to be officers or warrant officers, pass rigorous physical and mental examinations, and complete one of the most challenging training programs in the military. Most pilots came from the ranks of warrant officers, technical experts who specialized in their field. The more Sarah read, the more the idea took hold of her imagination. The seed that had been planted grew over the following weeks. Sarah began to see her future differently. She loved being a medic and took pride in saving lives. But the idea of flying, of having that kind of capability and responsibility, called to her in a way nothing else had. She started talking to some of the pilots who flew into the FOB, asking them about their experiences and the path they had taken. Most were encouraging, though they were honest about how difficult the training was. Sarah's deployment was scheduled to last 12 months, and she was approaching the halfway point. The time had been brutal in many ways, but it had also clarified something for her. She wanted to serve in a different capacity, to bring a different set of skills to the fight. The more she thought about becoming a pilot, the more right it felt. She would still be helping her fellow soldiers, but, from the sky, providing support and protection in ways a medic couldn't. 6 months into the deployment, Sarah's platoon conducted a major operation to clear an insurgent stronghold in a nearby valley. The operation involved multiple units and was expected to meet heavy resistance. Sarah prepared carefully, ensuring she had extra medical supplies and that she was ready for whatever might come. The convoy rolled out before dawn, the vehicles moving in tactical formation through the darkness. The fighting started as the sun rose. The insurgents were well prepared and fought from fortified positions in the rocky terrain. Gunfire echoed through the valley, and RPGs streaked across the sky. Sarah's vehicle took up a position where she could reach casualties quickly while staying relatively protected. The radio was constant chaos, units calling for support and reporting contact. Sarah waited, tense and ready, knowing it was only a matter of time before she was needed. The call came sooner than expected. A soldier from another platoon had been shot, and the wound was serious. Sarah grabbed her aid bag and ran toward the position, keeping low as bullets cracked overhead. The soldier, a sergeant she recognized from the base, had been hit in the abdomen. Sarah worked quickly, assessing the wound and providing treatment. The sergeant was conscious, but in terrible pain. Sarah talked to him calmly while she worked, her voice steady even as her mind raced through the steps she needed to take. As she stabilized the sergeant, Sarah became aware of a new sound cutting through the chaos. Apache helicopters appeared over the ridgeline, their weapons systems engaging enemy positions with devastating accuracy. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The insurgent fire slackened as the Apaches worked over their positions. Sarah watched in awe as the helicopters maneuvered, their pilots demonstrating incredible skill and precision. In that moment, watching those aircraft turn the tide of the battle, Sarah's decision crystallized completely. She was going to become a pilot. The transition back to the United States was jarring in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. Everything seemed too bright, too loud, too safe. People complained about trivial things while Sarah's mind was still processing the experiences of the past year. She took a month of leave and went home to Oklahoma, but the visit felt surreal. Her parents were overjoyed to have her back safely, yet Sarah could sense the distance that her experiences had created. She had seen and done things they could never fully understand, and that gulf between them was painful even though it was inevitable. Sarah spent her leave time doing two things with singular focus. First, she decompressed and tried to readjust to civilian normalcy, though it never quite felt normal. Second, she worked obsessively on her warrant officer packet and flight school application. The process was extensive and demanding. She needed to take the selection instrument for flight training, a computerized test that measured cognitive abilities, spatial reasoning, and mechanical comprehension. Sarah studied for the SIFT exam like her life depended on it, working through practice problems and reviewing concepts she hadn't thought about since high school. The day of the exam arrived, and Sarah drove to the testing center at a military installation 3 hours from her hometown. She was nervous but prepared. The test was challenging, requiring her to solve complex problems under time pressure and demonstrate skills she had specifically trained for. When she finished and received her score, Sarah felt a wave of relief. She had done well, scoring high enough to be competitive for aviation slots. It was the first major hurdle cleared, but many more lay ahead. The next step was the flight physical, arguably the most nerve-wracking part of the entire process. The military standards for pilots were incredibly strict. Vision had to be perfect or correctable to perfect. Depth perception, color vision, hearing, and cardiovascular health were all tested rigorously. Any disqualifying condition would end Sarah's dream before it really began. She traveled to Fort Rucker in Alabama for the comprehensive examination, spending 2 days being poked, prodded, and tested in ways she had never experienced. The doctors examined her eyes with specialized equipment, had her identify colored patterns to test for color blindness, and put her through hearing tests in soundproof booths. They checked her heart with an electrocardiogram, tested her blood for any irregularities, and evaluated her overall physical fitness. Sarah held her breath through each test, waiting for the moment when someone might tell her she didn't qualify. But when the final results came back, everything was within standards. She was medically qualified to fly. Sarah wanted to cry with relief, but she maintained her composure and simply thanked the medical staff. With the SIFT exam passed and the flight physical completed, Sarah submitted her complete warrant officer packet to the aviation branch. Now came the hardest part, waiting. The selection board only met a few times a year, and the competition was fierce. Hundreds of qualified applicants were vying for limited slots at flight school. Sarah tried to stay busy while she waited, returning to Fort Campbell and resuming her duties as a combat medic. But every day she checked her email and mail, hoping for news. The waiting period stretched on for 3 months. Sarah fell back into the routine of garrison life, which felt almost mundane after deployment. She conducted medical training for her unit, maintained her own skills, and mentored newer medics who were preparing for their first deployments. She also continued her physical training regimen, determined to stay in peak condition. Some mornings, she would run past the airfield at Fort Campbell, watching the helicopters take off and land, imagining herself in the cockpit. Finally, on a Tuesday morning in April, Sarah received the email she had been waiting for. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it. The message was brief and formal, but the keywords jumped out at her immediately. Selected for Warrant Officer Candidate School and Flight Training. Sarah read it 3 times to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding. She had been selected. She was going to flight school. The joy and excitement that flooded through her was unlike anything she had felt before. This was her chance, her opportunity to transform from medic to pilot. Sarah called her parents immediately to share the news. Her mother cried happy tears, and her father's voice was thick with pride. They were nervous about her flying helicopters in combat, but they understood how much this meant to her. Sarah also shared the news with her friends from deployment, many of whom congratulated her enthusiastically. Captain Williams, her physician assistant from Afghanistan, sent her a long email expressing his confidence in her abilities and wishing her success. The orders came a few weeks later. Sarah would report to Fort Rucker, Alabama, the home of Army aviation, in June. She had 2 months to prepare, to close out her current assignment, and to get ready for what would be the most challenging training of her life. Sarah used that time wisely, studying aviation concepts, reviewing mathematics and physics, and reading everything she could about helicopter flight. She wanted to arrive at Fort Rucker as prepared as possible. Warrant Officer Candidate School was the first major test. WOCS was designed to transform enlisted soldiers into warrant officers, the technical experts who formed the backbone of Army aviation. The school lasted 5 weeks and was deliberately intense. Sarah arrived at Fort Rucker on a hot June day, the Alabama humidity wrapping around her like a wet blanket. She joined a class of about 40 other candidates, all of them hoping to earn their spot in flight school. The first week of WOCS was designed to tear down the candidates and rebuild them in the mold of a warrant officer. The tactical officers who ran the school were relentless, demanding perfection in everything from the way candidates made their beds to how they marched in formation. Sarah had been through basic training and combat, so the physical demands weren't overwhelming, but the attention to detail was exhausting. Every aspect of their appearance, their rooms, and their conduct was scrutinized and criticized. Sarah and her fellow candidates formed study groups in the limited free time they had. They helped each other prepare for the constant tests on military history, leadership, and warrant officer responsibilities. Sarah found that her deployment experience gave her credibility with some of the candidates who had never been in combat. She was careful not to be arrogant about it, but she shared insights when they seemed relevant. The class bonded quickly under the shared pressure, becoming a tight-knit group that supported each other through the challenges. The final week of WOCS included a field training exercise that tested everything the candidates had learned. They had to navigate through the woods using map and compass, complete a series of physical and mental challenges, and demonstrate their leadership abilities under stress. Sarah excelled, drawing on her experience from deployment to stay calm and focused. When the exercise ended and the class returned to the schoolhouse, Sarah felt confident that she had performed well. Graduation from WOCS was a formal ceremony attended by families and fellow soldiers. Sarah's parents made the long drive from Oklahoma to see her commissioned as a warrant officer. As she crossed the stage and received her warrant, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had taken the first major step toward becoming a pilot. Her father pinned on her new rank insignia, his hands gentle despite their roughness from years of manual labor. Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering how proud she was. The very next day, Sarah began initial entry rotary wing training. This was where she would actually learn to fly. The first phase focused on academics, teaching the candidates the theory of helicopter flight, aerodynamics, weather, navigation, and aircraft systems. The classroom work was intense and technical. Sarah had never been particularly interested in physics, but now she needed to understand concepts like translating tendency, dissymmetry of lift, and the gyroscopic precession that made helicopters behave the way they did. The instructors were experienced pilots who had flown everything from medevac missions to special operations insertions. They didn't coddle the students, but they were passionate about aviation and wanted to see their students succeed. Sarah took copious notes, studied late into the night, and asked questions whenever something wasn't clear. The academics were followed by regular exams that candidates had to pass to continue in the program. The failure rate was significant, with roughly 20% of students washing out before ever getting into an aircraft. Sarah's first time in a helicopter was both terrifying and exhilarating. The aircraft was a TH-67 Creek, a training helicopter based on the civilian Bell 206. It was smaller than the Black Hawks and Apache she had seen in Afghanistan. But to Sarah, it was the most beautiful machine she had ever encountered. Her instructor pilot, a warrant officer named Mr. Jackson, briefed her on what they would do during the flight. He explained the controls, the emergency procedures, and what he expected from her. When the helicopter lifted off the ground, Sarah felt her stomach drop. The sensation of hovering was unlike anything she had experienced. The aircraft felt alive, responding to the tiniest inputs on the controls. Mr. Jackson let Sarah take the controls once they were airborne, and she immediately understood why helicopter pilots talked about flying as an art form. Coordinating the cyclic stick, the collective lever, the pedals, and the throttle while maintaining airhead and altitude was incredibly difficult. The helicopter wanted to drift and wobble, and Sarah's overcorrections made it worse. The first few flights were humbling. Sarah struggled with basic maneuvers that Mr. Jackson made look effortless. Hovering, which seemed simple from the ground, proved to be one of the hardest skills to master. The helicopter drifted constantly, requiring constant corrections that had to be smooth and measured. Sarah would overcorrect one way, then overcorrect back the other way, creating an oscillating pattern that her instructor called chasing the aircraft. He was patient but firm, explaining what she was doing wrong and demonstrating the right technique. The Apache training course began with a sobering briefing. The instructor pilots made it clear that this would be unlike anything the students had experienced so far. The AH-64 Apache was not just a helicopter. It was a complex weapons system that required pilots to master an enormous amount of information and skill. The aircraft had two crew positions: the front seat pilot, who primarily handled the weapons systems, and the back seat pilot, who primarily flew the aircraft. Both crew members needed to be proficient in both roles, able to switch seamlessly between flying and engaging targets. Sarah stood in front of an Apache on the flight line for the first time as a student pilot, and the aircraft was even more impressive up close than it had been from a distance in Afghanistan. The tandem cockpit, the stub wings loaded with weapons pylons, the chin-mounted 30mm chain gun, and the sophisticated sensor systems all spoke to the Apache's lethal purpose. This was a machine designed for one thing: destroying enemy forces on the battlefield. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and intimidation as she climbed into the front cockpit for her first familiarization flight. The cockpit was cramped and filled with displays, switches, and controls. Sarah's instructor, Chief Warrant Officer 3 Henderson, walked her through each system methodically. The integrated helmet and display sighting system, or HADS, was particularly impressive. The helmet had a monocle that displayed flight information and targeting data directly in front of the pilot's right eye. Wherever the pilot looked, the weapons could be aimed. It was technology that seemed like science fiction, yet here it was, an integral part of the Apache's capabilities. The academic phase of Apache training was intense beyond anything Sarah had experienced before. The students had to learn the aircraft systems in minute detail: the propulsion system, the hydraulics, the electrical systems, the avionics, and, most importantly, the weapon systems. The Apache could carry Hellfire missiles for destroying armored vehicles, Hydra rockets for area targets, and had the 30mm cannon for precision engagement. Each weapon had different employment techniques, different ranges, and different tactical applications. Sarah spent countless hours in the classroom absorbing information. She learned about the Target Acquisition Designation Site, the sophisticated sensor that could detect enemy forces day or night at long ranges. She studied the radar systems, the communication systems, and the defensive systems designed to protect the aircraft from enemy fire. The amount of information was overwhelming, and students who couldn't keep up quickly fell behind. Sarah made extensive study guides, created flashcards, and formed study groups with other students to help everyone master the material. The first time Sarah actually flew an Apache was a revelation. The aircraft was powerful and responsive, but it handled differently than the training helicopter she had learned on. The Apache was heavier, more stable in flight, but also more complex to operate. Every action required coordination between the two crew members. Sarah started in the back seat, learning to fly the aircraft while her instructor in front managed the weapons systems and provided guidance. The Apache demanded smooth, precise control inputs, and Sarah had to adjust her technique from what she had learned in the lighter training aircraft. Night flying in the Apache introduced Sarah to another level of complexity. The Apache was designed to operate at night, when it could use its sophisticated sensors to find and destroy enemy forces that were blind in the darkness. The pilots flew using night vision goggles, which turned the dark landscape into shades of green. Everything looked different through the goggles, and depth perception became challenging. Sarah had to learn to trust her instruments and her training, flying low over the terrain while monitoring multiple systems and maintaining her situational awareness. One of the most challenging aspects of Apache flying was learning to work as part of a crew. Unlike other aircraft where one pilot clearly flew while the other managed other tasks, Apache pilots constantly shared responsibilities. The front seater might be engaging a target while the back seater flew. Then, moments later, they would switch roles as the tactical situation changed. This required clear communication, mutual trust, and the ability to anticipate what your crew member needed. Sarah was paired with another student, Warrant Officer Jake Morrison, for much of the training. They had to learn each other's flying styles, communication patterns, and how to work together under pressure. The weapons training phase pushed Sarah to integrate everything she had learned. She spent hours in simulators, practicing target engagement sequences until they became second nature. The process was systematic. Acquire the target using the sensors, identify it as hostile, select the appropriate weapon, designate the target, and engage. In practice, this had to happen quickly, often while the aircraft was moving and under simulated enemy fire. Sarah learned to manage the stress, to follow her checklists, and to verify each step before releasing weapons. Live fire exercises brought a new level of excitement and responsibility. Sarah's first time firing a Hellfire missile from an Apache was an experience she would never forget. The aircraft was stable in a hover at the firing position. The target, a derelict tank, was clearly designated on her display. She went through the engagement sequence, received clearance from her instructor, and squeezed the trigger. The missile launched with a roar, leaving a trail of smoke as it guided toward the target. Seconds later, the tank erupted in a ball of flame as the Hellfire's warhead detonated. The destructive power was both awesome and sobering. This was what she would bring to the battlefield. Sarah practiced with all the Apache's weapons systems. She fired rockets at area targets, watching them impact in rippling explosions across the range. She engaged targets with the 30mm cannon, learning to compensate for the aircraft's movement and the ballistics of the rounds. Each weapon system required different techniques and skills, and Sarah worked to master them all. The instructors were demanding, expecting precision and discipline in every engagement. A real battle wouldn't forgive mistakes, and the training reflected that reality. As the training progressed, the scenarios became more complex and realistic. Sarah flew missions that simulated combat operations, with multiple targets, time constraints, and simulated enemy air defenses that she had to avoid or suppress. She learned to coordinate with ground forces, providing close air support while avoiding fratricide. She practiced battle handovers, where one Apache team would pass control of a fight to another team seamlessly. These exercises tested not just her flying and weapon skills, but her tactical decision-making and ability to handle stress. The culminating event of Apache training was a realistic combat exercise conducted at night. Sarah and Jake Morrison flew as a team, one of several Apache crews participating in a complex scenario involving ground forces in contact with a simulated enemy. The mission required them to navigate to the battle area using only their instruments and night vision, establish communication with the ground commander, identify enemy positions without hitting friendly forces, and engage multiple targets with different weapon systems. Sarah flew in the back seat while Jake operated the weapons from the front. The night was dark, with no moon, and the landscape below was a patchwork of green shadows through her night vision goggles. They flew low and fast, using the terrain to mask their approach. When they reached the battle area, Jake began scanning with the targeting system while Sarah positioned the aircraft for optimal engagement. The radio was active with calls from the ground forces, painting a picture of a chaotic close-quarters battle. Jake identified the first target, an enemy fighting position firing on friendly troops. Sarah maneuvered the Apache into position while Jake selected rockets and designated the target. The rockets launched with a distinctive whoosh, and seconds later impacts lit up the night as the enemy position was destroyed. They moved to the next target, then the next, working through the engagement sequence smoothly despite the pressure. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, her mind processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. This was what all the training had been building toward. The exercise lasted over an hour, with Sarah and Jake engaging multiple targets and providing continuous support to the ground forces. When they finally turned for home and climbed away from the battle area, Sarah felt exhausted but exhilarated. The debrief the next day was thorough, with the instructors going through every decision and action. There were areas for improvement, but overall the assessment was positive. Sarah and Jake had performed well under realistic combat conditions. Graduation from Apache training was another major milestone. Sarah had completed one of the most demanding training programs in the military and earned her wings as an Apache pilot. Her parents attended the ceremony, along with a few friends from her time as a medic. When the commander pinned the aviator wings on her uniform, Sarah felt a surge of pride and accomplishment. She had transformed herself from a combat medic into a pilot of one of the most sophisticated weapons systems in the world. The journey had been long and difficult, but she had never quit, never given up on the dream that had started in Afghanistan. After graduation, Sarah received orders to Fort Hood, Texas, home to several Apache battalions. She was assigned to the 1st Battalion, 227th Aviation Regiment, a unit with a distinguished combat history. Sarah arrived at Fort Hood in the middle of a hot Texas summer, the flat landscape and sprawling base a stark contrast to the mountains of Afghanistan and the forests of Alabama. She reported to her new unit with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She was now a qualified Apache pilot, but she was also the new person in a unit of experienced aviators. The battalion welcomed Sarah professionally, but with an undercurrent of evaluation. She would have to prove herself capable, especially given that many of the other pilots had combat experience in Apaches. Sarah was assigned to a flight within one of the companies, joining 3 other pilots and 2 aircraft. Her initial aircraft commander was Chief Warrant Officer For Martinez, a veteran with 2 combat tours and thousands of hours in the Apache. Martinez was professional and methodical, and he made it clear that Sarah had a lot to learn despite her completion of flight school. The learning curve at the unit was steep. Flight school had taught Sarah how to fly and employ the Apache, but the unit taught her how to operate as part of a larger team executing complex missions. She learned the battalion's tactics, techniques, and procedures. She studied the different mission sets the unit might execute, from close air support to armed reconnaissance to raid security. She flew training missions almost daily, building her proficiency and her hours. Martinez was a demanding instructor, but he was also fair, recognizing when Sarah did well and providing constructive criticism when she needed improvement. One aspect of unit life that Sarah had to adjust to was the maintenance culture. Apaches were complex machines that required constant care and attention. Pilots were expected to understand their aircraft intimately, to work closely with the maintenance crews, and to ensure their helicopters were mission-ready. Sarah spent time in the hangar learning about the aircraft systems from the perspective of the maintainers. She developed relationships with the crew chiefs and specialists who kept the Apaches flying, understanding that their expertise was crucial to the mission. 6 months into her time at Fort Hood, Sarah's battalion received the forward operating base in Afghanistan had changed since Sarah's last deployment there, but it also felt eerily familiar. The same HESCO barriers lined the perimeter, the same dust covered everything, and the same sense of danger hung in the air. But Sarah's perspective had transformed completely. Instead of living in the plywood huts with the ground troops, she was now housed in the aviation area near the flight line. Instead of carrying a medical aid bag, she was responsible for a $30 million attack helicopter. The transformation felt surreal even as it felt right. Sarah's first week in country was focused on acclimatization and mission preparation. The battalion conducted orientation flights, getting pilots familiar with the terrain and the operating area. Sarah flew with Martinez in the back seat while he pointed out key features: the valleys where insurgents frequently operated, the forward operating bases they would support, the landing zones they might use in emergencies, and the areas where the terrain created challenges for navigation and communication. Afghanistan looked the same from the air as Sarah remembered from the ground, but seeing it from the Apache's cockpit gave her a new appreciation for the tactical situation. The mission tempo was high from the beginning. The Apache crews flew daily, providing overwatch for ground patrols, escorting convoys, and conducting reconnaissance in areas suspected of insurgent activity. Sarah's first real mission came on her 5th day in country. Intelligence had identified a compound in a remote valley as a Taliban logistics hub. A special forces team was planning a raid, and the Apaches were tasked with providing security and close air support if needed. Sarah and Martinez launched before dawn, their Apache loaded with Hellfire missiles, and a full load of 30mm ammunition. Another Apache crewed by 2 experienced pilots accompanied them, forming a standard 2-ship team. The flight to the objective area took 40 minutes, with the crews flying low through the mountain valleys using their night vision systems. Sarah flew in the back seat, her eyes scanning the instruments and the terrain outside, while Martinez managed the weapons systems and maintained communication with the ground force. As they approached the target area, the tension in the cockpit increased. Sarah could feel her heart rate elevate, her senses sharpening with adrenaline. This was real combat, not a training exercise. If things went wrong, people could die. The Special Forces team was already on the ground, moving silently toward the compound. The Apaches took up positions nearby, using their sensors to scan the area for any threats. Sarah maneuvered the aircraft precisely, following Martinez's directions while maintaining her situational awareness of where the friendly forces were located. The raid went smoothly at first. The Special Forces team entered the compound and began clearing buildings. Then, the radio crackled with urgent transmissions. The team had made contact with enemy fighters, and a firefight had erupted. Martinez immediately began scanning for targets with the Apache's sophisticated sensors, while Sarah positioned the aircraft for engagement. The challenge was identifying which figures on the thermal display were friendly and which were enemy, a life-or-death distinction in the chaos of close combat. Martinez identified enemy fighters on a rooftop firing down at the Special Forces team. He designated the target carefully, double-checking that he had correctly identified the enemy position and that no friendly forces were in the danger zone. Sarah held the aircraft steady in a hover while Martinez engaged with the 30mm cannon. The gun roared, and Sarah watched the tracers arc down toward the target. The enemy fire from the rooftop stopped immediately. Martinez shifted to another target, then another, supporting the ground team methodically and precisely. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt much longer. When the Special Forces team reported they had secured the compound and were beginning their search, the Apaches resumed their overwatch positions. Sarah's hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline as she flew the aircraft in a wide orbit around the compound. Martinez looked back at her and nodded. She had done well under fire, maintaining her composure and performing her job. For Sarah, it was validation that all her training had prepared her for this moment. Over the following weeks, Sarah flew mission after mission. Some were routine reconnaissance flights where nothing happened. Others involved intense combat supporting troops in contact. She learned to trust her instincts and her training to make split-second decisions that could save lives or prevent civilian casualties. The Apache proved to be everything Sarah had hoped it would be, a precision instrument that could bring devastating firepower exactly where it was needed. One mission stood out as particularly challenging. A Marine unit had been ambushed in a narrow valley, taking casualties and pinned down by insurgent forces in well-fortified positions. Sarah and Martinez launched immediately when the call came, racing to provide support. When they arrived on station, the situation was desperate. The Marines were taking fire from multiple directions, unable to maneuver without exposing themselves to additional risk. The weather was deteriorating with clouds moving into the valley, and the sun was setting, complicating the engagement. Martinez moved to the front seat to employ the weapons, while Sarah took the controls and back. The terrain was treacherous, with steep mountainsides rising on both sides of the valley and limited maneuvering room. Sarah had to fly aggressively to get into position for Martinez to engage while avoiding enemy fire and maintaining safe clearance from the terrain. The stress was immense, but Sarah channeled it into focus, flying the aircraft with precision while processing all the radio calls and maintaining her mental picture of where everyone was located. Martinez began engaging enemy positions systematically, using Hellfire missiles against fortified positions and the 30mm cannon against fighters in the open. Sarah adjusted the aircraft's position constantly, giving Martinez the best possible angles while staying aware of their fuel state and ammunition remaining. The other Apache in their team worked from a different position, and the two crews coordinated their fires to maximum effect. Slowly, the enemy fire began to diminish as the Apaches destroyed position after position. The Marines were able to maneuver under the Apaches' protective fires, moving their wounded to safer positions and establishing a landing zone for medical evacuation. Sarah held the Apache in a steady orbit while a medevac helicopter braved the deteriorating weather and enemy fire to extract the casualties. Only when the medevac was safely away did the Apaches depart the area, their ammunition nearly exhausted and their fuel running low. The flight back to base was quiet, both pilots processing what they had just experienced. The mission debrief revealed the full scope of what had happened. The Apaches had engaged and destroyed 12 enemy fighting positions and vehicles during the battle, breaking the ambush and saving the Marine unit from potentially catastrophic casualties. The Marine commander sent a personal message thanking the Apache crews for their support. For Sarah, it was a profound moment. She had come full circle, from treating wounded soldiers as a medic to preventing soldiers from being wounded in the first place by destroying the enemy that threatened them. News of the mission spread through the battalion. Sarah had proven herself in combat, demonstrating skill and courage under fire. Martinez told her privately that she had flown as well as any pilot he had worked with, and coming from someone with his experience, the compliment meant everything. Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from the destruction they had caused, but from knowing they had protected those Marines and helped bring them home safely. The deployment continued with a steady rhythm of missions. Sarah's proficiency grew with each flight, her confidence building as she accumulated combat hours and experience. She worked with different aircraft commanders, learning from each of them and developing her own style and techniques. The Apache became an extension of herself, the controls responding to her inputs almost intuitively. She learned to read the battlefield, to anticipate what would happen next, and to position herself advantageously. Sarah also saw the larger picture of the war. Despite all the advanced technology and firepower the coalition possessed, the conflict was grinding and complex. The enemy adapted to their tactics, finding new ways to strike at coalition forces while avoiding direct confrontation with air power. The local population was caught in the middle, suffering regardless of who won individual battles. Sarah sometimes thought about her time as a medic, treating both coalition soldiers and Afghan civilians who were caught in the crossfire. The moral complexity of it all weighed on her, but she found purpose in protecting the soldiers who were trying to make a difference. Midway through the deployment, Sarah was upgraded to aircraft commander status. This meant she would now lead missions and be responsible for the aircraft and crew. It was both an honor and an added responsibility. Her first mission as aircraft commander was routine reconnaissance, but Sarah felt the weight of the new role. Everything that happened was ultimately her responsibility. She prepared meticulously, conducting a thorough brief with her front-seater and ensuring they both understood the mission, the threats, and the procedures they would use. The mission went smoothly, and Sarah's confidence in her new role grew. She led more complex missions, coordinating with other aircraft and ground forces to accomplish objectives. The skills she had learned as a medic, the ability to stay calm under pressure and make decisions quickly, served her well as an aircraft commander. Sarah developed a reputation in the battalion as a skilled and reliable pilot who could be counted on in difficult situations. One of the most memorable missions of Sarah's deployment came near the end of her tour. A coalition outpost in a remote area came under heavy attack during the night. The insurgents had massed a significant force and were using coordinated tactics to try to overrun the position. The defenders were holding but needed air support desperately. Sarah and her co-pilot launched into the darkness, flying through rough weather to reach the embattled outpost. When they arrived, the situation was chaotic. The outpost was surrounded, with enemy forces attacking from multiple directions. Tracer fire lit up the darkness, and explosions bloomed across Sarah's night vision display. She established communication with the ground commander, who quickly laid out the tactical situation. The enemy had vehicles supporting their attack, including a technical truck with a heavy machine gun that was causing significant problems for the defenders. Sarah designated the technical as their priority target. Using the Apache's targeting systems, she located the vehicle and confirmed it was engaging the outpost. She selected a Hellfire missile, double-checked that she had the right target, and that the engagement was clear, and fired. The missile streaked through the darkness and obliterated the technical in a massive explosion. Sarah immediately shifted to the next threat, working through the engagement sequence again and again. The battle lasted for over 2 hours, with Sarah's Apache and another that arrived shortly after providing continuous fire support. They destroyed vehicles, fighting positions, and broke up enemy formations trying to mass for assaults. The defenders of the outpost fought bravely, but without the Apache's support, they would likely have been overrun. As dawn broke and the enemy withdrew, Sarah conducted a final reconnaissance around the outpost to ensure no enemy forces remained nearby. The ground commander's voice came over the radio, thick with emotion and exhaustion. He thanked the Apache crews for saving his soldiers' lives. Sarah responded professionally, but inside she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was why she had become a pilot, to have this capability and use it to protect those who needed it. The mission had required her to use all her skills, all her training, and all her experience. She had met the challenge and made a difference. When Sarah's deployment ended and she returned to the United States, she had logged over 300 combat hours in the Apache. She had participated in dozens of missions and had been directly responsible for destroying 12 enemy vehicles and numerous fighting positions. More importantly, she had helped protect countless soldiers on the ground, preventing casualties and supporting critical operations. The battalion held a ceremony to recognize the pilots for their achievements, and Sarah received an Air Medal with Valor Device for her actions during the defense of the remote outpost. Returning home was complex. Sarah was proud of what she had accomplished, but also reflective about the cost of war. She had seen destruction and death up close from both the ground and the air. She understood in a deep way the human cost of conflict and the responsibility that came with wielding such powerful weapons. But she also knew that when used properly, the Apache could protect lives and give soldiers a fighting chance in desperate situations. Sarah continued her career as an Apache pilot, deploying again and eventually becoming an instructor pilot herself, teaching new aviators the skills she had learned through years of training and combat. She never forgot her roots as a combat medic, and that experience informed how she approached her missions as a pilot. She had been the person on the ground needing air support, and now she was the person providing that support. The journey from medic to Apache pilot had transformed her life, giving her purpose and the opportunity to serve at the highest level. Years later, when people asked Sarah about her experiences, she spoke about both roles with pride. She had saved lives with her medical skills and protected lives with her flying skills. Both were forms of service. Both required courage and dedication. The young woman who had joined the army to help people had found ways to do exactly that, whether treating wounds in a combat aid station or destroying enemy forces from an Apache's cockpit. Sarah's story was one of transformation and dedication, of turning a dream into reality through relentless effort and unwavering commitment to serving others. She had become exactly what she set out to be, a soldier who made a difference when it mattered most. At a warning order for deployment. They would be heading to Afghanistan the following year to provide aviation support to ground forces in the region. The news sent a ripple of activity through the unit as everyone began preparing for combat operations. For Sarah, this was what everything had been leading to. She had deployed as a medic, but now she would return as an Apache pilot. The thought filled her with determination and a sense of coming full circle. The pre-deployment training intensified. The battalion conducted field exercises simulating Afghan conditions and scenarios. Sarah flew mission after mission, practicing the skills she would need in combat. She studied intelligence reports on the enemy tactics in Afghanistan, learning about the threats she would face. The Taliban had learned hard lessons about American air power over the years, and they had adapted their tactics accordingly. They rarely massed in large groups that could be easily destroyed, instead operating in small teams that could quickly disperse when aircraft appeared. Sarah also focused on her physical fitness, knowing that combat operations would be physically and mentally demanding. She ran in the Texas heat, worked out with weights, and practiced hand-to-hand combat techniques. She wanted to be ready for anything, to never be the weak link in the team. Martinez noticed her dedication and commented that she had the right attitude for combat operations. Coming from someone with his experience, the praise meant a great deal to Sarah. As the deployment date approached, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. She was confident in her abilities as a pilot and in her crew's capabilities. She knew the Apache was a formidable weapons system and that they would make a real difference in the fight. But she also remembered the casualties from her first deployment, the soldiers she had treated, and the ones she couldn't save. Now she would have the power to protect those soldiers, to provide them with support when they needed it most. That responsibility weighed on her, but it also drove her to be as prepared as possible. The battalion departed for Afghanistan in the spring, flying first to a staging base in Kuwait before moving forward to their operating location in Afghanistan. Sarah watched the Afghan landscape appear below the transport aircraft as they descended, the familiar brown mountains and valleys bringing back memories from her time as a medic. But this time was different. This time she was coming back as a pilot, ready to bring the Apache's firepower to bear against the enemies of the soldiers on the ground. As the aircraft touched down and Sarah gathered her gear, she felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Slowly, through hours of practice and persistent effort, Sarah began to improve. The movements became more natural, her corrections smoother. She learned to anticipate the helicopter's behavior, to feel through the controls what the aircraft was going to do next. Hovering became less of a battle and more of a dance. She progressed to basic maneuvers, learning to take off and land, to fly patterns around the airfield, and to navigate from point to point using visual references on the ground. The training was organized into specific phases, each building on the previous one. After basic contact flying, Sarah moved on to instrument training, learning to fly the helicopter using only the gauges and instruments inside the cockpit. This was crucial for flying in bad weather or at night when visual references weren't available. Sarah found instrument flying intellectually challenging, but satisfying. It was like solving a puzzle while flying an aircraft, requiring her to build a mental picture of where she was and where she was going based solely on needles and numbers. Throughout the training, students were regularly evaluated through check rides, flights with an evaluator who tested their skills and knowledge. These rides were stressful, with the evaluator throwing emergency scenarios and difficult situations at the student to see how they reacted. Sarah approached each check ride with thorough preparation, chair-flying the maneuvers in her room and reviewing procedures until she could recite them from memory. She passed each check ride, though not always with the highest marks. There were areas where she needed improvement, and her instructors made sure she knew exactly what those were. One aspect of training that Sarah found particularly challenging was auto-rotations, a maneuver used when the engine fails. In an auto-rotation, the pilot has to use the air flowing up through the rotor blades to keep them spinning while gliding the helicopter down to a landing. It required precise control and timing, and it was completely counterintuitive. The first time Mr. Jackson demonstrated an auto-rotation, Sarah was certain they were going to crash. But, at the last possible moment, he flared the helicopter, trading airspeed for lift, and settled gently onto the ground. It was like magic, except it was pure skill and technique. Learning to perform auto-rotations herself was nerve-wracking. Sarah had to overcome her instinct to panic when the engine quit and instead focus on executing the proper steps. Establish the correct glide speed, pick a landing spot, manage the descent, and time the flare perfectly. If she flared too early, the helicopter would run out of energy and fall the last few feet. Too late, and they would hit the ground too hard. After dozens of practice auto-rotations, Sarah developed the muscle memory and timing needed to perform them safely. It gave her confidence that she could handle an emergency if it ever happened for real. As Sarah progressed through the training phases, she had to make a crucial decision. Which aircraft would she specialize in? The Army had several types of helicopters, each with different roles. Black Hawks were the workhorses, used for assault transport and medevac. Chinooks were heavy lifters, capable of carrying large loads. Kiowas were scouts, small and agile. And then, there were the Apaches, the premier attack helicopter in the world. Sarah had known since watching those Apaches in Afghanistan what she wanted to fly, but the selection process was competitive and based partly on class ranking. Sarah redoubled her efforts, determined to rank high enough to get her choice. She spent extra time in the simulators, practiced maneuvers until they were perfect, and studied until she could answer any question the instructors threw at her. Her dedication paid off. When the class rankings were posted, Sarah was in the top 10%. When aircraft selection day arrived, she put Apache as her first choice and held her breath. When the assignments were announced, Sarah's name appeared next to AH-64 Apache. She had done it. She was going to be an Apache pilot. The celebration that night was subdued but meaningful. Sarah and the other students who had made it this far knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Apache training was legendarily difficult, and many students who made it through initial rotary wing training still washed out of their aircraft-specific course. But Sarah had come too far to worry about that now. She called her parents to share the news, hearing the mix of pride and concern in their voices. Then, she began preparing for the next phase of her journey, the phase that would transform her from a helicopter pilot into an Apache weapons system operator. The evacuation helicopter arrived and took the wounded sergeant away. Sarah returned to her position, but something had shifted inside her. She had seen what pilots could do, the difference they could make in a desperate situation. She wanted to be part of that, to have that capability. The rest of the operation continued for 2 more days, but Sarah's mind was already working on what she would need to do to achieve her new goal. When the operation concluded and the unit returned to the FOB, Sarah sought out Captain Williams. She told him about her decision to apply for flight school. Williams listened carefully, then nodded. He told her she would make a good pilot, that she had the right combination of intelligence, courage, and dedication. He also warned her that the path would not be easy, that she would face skepticism and challenges. Sarah acknowledged this, but said she was ready. Williams smiled and told her he would support her application however he could. The remainder of Sarah's deployment took on new meaning. Every day was still focused on her duties as a medic, but now she was also preparing for her future. She studied for the warrant officer exam, requested letters of recommendation, and began the application process. The administrative work was complicated by being deployed, but Sarah was determined. She filled out forms on base computers, coordinated with personnel offices back in the States, and gathered all the necessary documents. Sarah also threw herself into physical training with renewed intensity. Pilots needed to be in excellent physical condition, and she wanted to arrive at flight school already exceeding the standards. She ran longer distances, worked on her strength training, and pushed herself harder than ever before. Some of her fellow soldiers thought she was crazy, training so hard in an already demanding environment. But Sarah didn't care. She had a goal now, something to drive toward. The final months of deployment were the hardest. Knowing that she would soon be leaving the combat zone made each dangerous mission feel even more precarious. Sarah treated more casualties, lived through more rocket attacks on the base, and said goodbye to soldiers who were killed in action. Each loss reinforced her desire to become a pilot, to gain the tools to better protect the people she served alongside. When the deployment finally ended and Sarah boarded the plane back to the United States, she felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief at leaving the danger behind, pride in what she had accomplished, and grief for what had been lost. But underneath it all was excitement for what came next. She was going home, but not for long. She had an application to complete and a dream to chase. As the plane lifted off from Bagram for the last time, Sarah looked out at the Afghan landscape disappearing below and silently promised herself that she would return to this fight, but next time as a pilot. Yield exercises, refined their tactics, and ensured all their equipment was in perfect working order. Sarah attended additional medical training focused specifically on the types of injuries common in Afghanistan. She learned about blast injuries from improvised explosive devices, the devastating effects of shrapnel, and the challenges of providing care in remote, hostile environments. The instructors emphasized the importance of the golden hour, that critical window after an injury when proper treatment made the biggest difference in survival. Sarah also began studying the geography and culture of Afghanistan. She wanted to understand the people and the place where she would be serving. She read about the country's history, its complex tribal structures, and the ongoing conflict that had drawn American forces there. The more she learned, the more she realized how complicated the situation was. There were no simple answers or easy solutions, just people trying to navigate impossible circumstances. Her parents struggled with the news of her deployment. Her mother cried during their phone calls, though she tried to hide it. Her father's voice was tight with worry, though he expressed pride in Sarah's service. They were scared for their daughter, and Sarah couldn't blame them. She was scared too, though she tried not to show it. Fear was natural, her sergeant told her, but courage was about acting despite that fear, about doing your job even when every instinct screamed at you to run and hide. The weeks before deployment passed quickly. Sarah went home on leave to spend time with her family. The visit was bittersweet, filled with unspoken worries and forced normalcy. Her parents threw a small party, inviting relatives and old friends. Everyone thanked Sarah for her service, but she could see the fear in their eyes. They were proud of her, but they also knew the risks she was taking. Sarah hugged her mother extra tight when it was time to leave, memorizing the feel of home before she stepped into the unknown. Back at Fort Campbell, the final preparations were frantic. Sarah packed and repacked her gear, making sure she had everything she might need. Her aid bag was meticulously organized, every item in its place so she could find it by touch if necessary. She attended endless briefings about the situation in Afghanistan, the rules of engagement, and what to expect when they arrived. The anticipation was almost worse than the actual danger would be, a constant knot of tension in her stomach. The day of departure arrived cold and gray. The soldiers gathered in formation, their families clustered nearby for final goodbyes. Sarah saw other parents, spouses, and children saying farewell to their loved ones, and the weight of what they were all doing settled over her. This was real. They were going to war. Sarah boarded the plane with her unit, settling into the uncomfortable seats for the long flight overseas. As the aircraft lifted off and Fort Campbell disappeared below, Sarah felt a mix of fear, determination, and purpose. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready to face it.